Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to read chapter 17 from the book Momo by Michael Ende. Chapter 17 is called The Square. Momo was too scared to go back to the amphitheater. She felt sure the man in gray would turn up there for their midnight meeting, and the thought of being all alone with him in the deserted ruins filled her with terror. No, she never wished to see him again, neither there nor anywhere else. Whatever his proposition might be, it boded no good for her and her friends. That was as plain as a pikestaff. But where could she hide from him? A crowded place seemed the best bet. Although no one had taken any notice before, if the man in gray really tried to harm her and she called for help, people would surely hear and come to her aid. Besides, she told herself, she'd be harder to find in a crowd than on her own. So Momo spent the rest of the afternoon walking the busiest streets and squares surrounded by jostling pedestrians. All through the evening and well into the night, she continued to trudge in a big circle that brought her back to her starting point. Around and around she went, swept along by a fast-flowing tide of humanity, until she had completed no fewer than 3 of these circuits. After keeping this up for so many hours, her weary feet began to ache. It grew later and later, but still she walked, half asleep, on and on and on. Just a little rest, she told herself at last. Just a teeny little rest, and then I'll be more on my guard. Parked beside the curb was a little 3-wheeled delivery truck, laden with an assortment of sacks and cartons. Momo climbed aboard, found herself a nice soft sack, and leaned her back against it. She drew up her weary feet and tucked them under her skirt. My, did that feel good. She heaved a sigh of relief, snuggled up against the sack, and was asleep before she knew it. But she was haunted by the weirdest dreams. In one of them, she saw old Beppo, with his broom held crossways like a balancing pole, teetering along a tightrope suspended above a dark chasm. Where's the other end? She heard him call, over and over again. I can't see the other end. And the tightrope did indeed seem infinitely long, so long that it stretched away into the darkness in both directions. Momo yearned to help the old man, but she couldn't even attract his attention. He was too high up and too far away. Then she saw Guido, pulling a paper streamer out of his mouth. He pulled and pulled, but the streamer was endless and unbreakable. In fact, he was already standing on a big mound of paper. It seemed to Momo that he was gazing at her imploringly, as if he would suffocate unless she came to his rescue. She tried to run to him, but her feet became entangled in the coils of paper, and the more she struggled to free herself, the more entangled she became. And then she saw the children. They were all as flat as playing cards, and each card had a pattern of little holes punched in it. Every time the cards were shuffled, they had to sort themselves out and be punched with a new pattern of holes. The card children were crying bitterly, but all Momo could hear was a sort of clattering sound as they were shuffled yet again and fluttered down on top of each other. Stop, she shouted, but her feeble voice was drowned by the clatter, which grew louder and louder until it finally woke her up. It was dark, and for a moment she couldn't think where she was. Then she remembered climbing aboard the delivery truck and realized that it was on the move. That was what had woken her, the sound of the engine. Momo wiped her cheeks, which were still wet with tears, and wondered where she could be. The truck had evidently been on the move for some time because it was in a different part of the city. At this late hour, not a soul could be seen in the streets. Not a light showed anywhere in the tall buildings that flanked them. The truck was going quite slowly, and Momo, without stopping to think, jumped out. She began walking in the opposite direction, eager to get back to the crowded streets that seemed to offer protection from the man in gray. Then, remembering her nightmares, she came to a halt. The sound of the engine gradually faded until silence enveloped the darkened street. She would stop running away, Momo decided. She had done so in the hope of saving herself. All this time she had been preoccupied with herself, her own loneliness and fear, when it was really her friends who were in trouble. If anyone could save them, she could. Remote as the chances of persuading the men in gray to release them might be, she must at least try. Once she reached this conclusion, she felt a mysterious change come over her. Her feelings of fear and helplessness had reached such a pitch that they were suddenly transformed into their opposites. Having overcome them, she felt courageous and self-confident enough to tackle any power on earth. More precisely, she had ceased to worry about herself. Now she wanted to meet the man in gray, wanted to at all costs. I must go to the amphitheater at once, she told herself. Perhaps it still isn't too late. Perhaps he'll be waiting for me. That, however, was easier said than done. She didn't know where she was and hadn't the least idea of which direction to take, but she started walking anyway. On and on she walked through the dark, silent streets. Being barefoot, she couldn't even hear her own footsteps. Every time she turned a corner, she hoped to see something that would tell her she was on the right track, some landmark she recognized, but she never did. She couldn't ask the way either, because the only living creature she saw was a grimy, emaciated dog that was foraging for scraps in a rubbish heap and fled in panic at her approach. At last she came to a huge, deserted square. It wasn't a handsome square with trees or a fountain in the middle, but an empty, featureless expanse fringed with buildings whose dark shapes stood outlined against the night sky. Momo set off across the square. When she reached the middle, a clock began to chime not far away. It chimed a good many times, so perhaps it was already midnight. If the man in gray was waiting for her at the amphitheater, Momo reflected, she had no chance at all of getting there in time. He would go away without seeing her, and any chance of saving her friends would be gone, perhaps forever. She chewed her knuckles, wondering what to do. She had absolutely no idea. "Here I am," she called into the darkness, as loud as she could. She had no real hope that the man in gray would hear her, but she was wrong. Scarcely had the last chime died away when lights appeared in all the streets that led to the big, empty square, faint at first, but steadily growing brighter, drawing nearer. And then Momo realized that they were the headlights of innumerable cars, all converging on the spot where she stood. Dazzled by the glare no matter which way she turned, she shielded her eyes with her hand. So they were coming after all. But Momo hadn't expected them to come in such strength. For a moment, all her newfound courage deserted her. Hemmed in and unable to escape, she shrank as far as she could into her baggy old jacket. Then, remembering the hour lilies and the mighty chorus of voices, she instantly felt comforted. The strength flowed back into her limbs. Meanwhile, while with their engines purring softly, the cars had continued their slow advance. At last they stopped, bumper to bumper, in a circle whose central point was Momo herself. The men in gray got out. Momo couldn't see how many of them there were because they remained outside the ring of headlights, but she sensed that many eyes were on her, unfriendly eyes, and a shiver ran down her spine. No one spoke for a while, neither Momo nor any of the men in gray. Then a flat, expressionless voice broke the silence. "I see," it said. "So this is Momo, the girl who thought she could defy us. Just look at her now, the miserable creature." Those words were followed by a dry, rattling sound that vaguely resembled a chorus of mocking laughter. "Careful," hissed another gray voice. "You know how dangerous she can be. It's no use trying to deceive her. Momo pricked up her ears at this. Very well, said the first voice from the darkness beyond the headlights. Let's try the truth for a change. Another long silence fell. Momo sensed that the men in gray were afraid to tell the truth, so afraid that it imposed a tremendous strain on them. She heard what sounded like a gasp of exertion from 1,000 throats. At long last, one of the disembodied voices began to speak. It came from a different direction, but it was just as flat and expressionless as the others. All right, let's be blunt. You're all on your own, little girl. Your friends are out of reach, so you've no one to share your time with. We planned it that way. You see how powerful we are. There's no point in trying to resist us. What do they amount to? All these lonely hours of yours. A curse and a burden, nothing more. You're completely cut off from the rest of mankind. Momo listened and said nothing. Sooner or later, the voice droned on, you won't be able to endure it any longer. Tomorrow, next week, next year, it's all the same to us. We shall simply bide our time because we know that in due course you'll come crawling to us and say, I'll do anything, anything at all, as long as you relieve me of my burden. But perhaps you've already reached that stage. You only have to say. Momo shook her head. So you won't let us help you, the voice pursued coldly. Momo felt an icy breeze envelop her from all sides at once, but she gritted her teeth and shook her head again. She knows what time is, whispered another voice. That proves she really was with a certain person, the first voice replied, also in a whisper. Aloud it asked, Do you know Professor Aura? Momo nodded. You actually paid him a visit? She nodded again. So you know about the hour lilies? She nodded a third time. Oh yes, how well she knew. There was another longish silence. When the voice began to speak again, it came from another direction. You love your friends, don't you? Another nod. And you'd like to set them free? Yet another nod. You could if only you would. Momo was shivering with cold in every limb. She drew the jacket more tightly around her. It wouldn't take much to save them. You help us and we'll help you. That's only fair, isn't it? The voice was coming from yet another direction. Momo stared intently at its source. The thing is, we'd like to make Professor Aura's acquaintance, but we don't know where he lives. All we want is for you to show us the way. That's right, Momo. Listen carefully, so you know we're being honest with you and mean what we say. In return, we'll give you back your friends and let you all lead the carefree, happy-go-lucky life you used to enjoy so much. Isn't that a worthwhile offer? If that isn't a worthwhile offer, what is? Momo opened her mouth for the first time. It was quite an effort to speak at all. Her lips felt so numb. What do you want with Professor Aura? She asked. I told you we want to make his acquaintance, the voice said sharply, and the air grew even colder. That's all you need to know. Momo said nothing, just waited. I don't understand you, said the voice. Think of yourself and your friends. Why worry about Professor Aura? He's old enough to look after himself. Besides, if he's sensible and cooperates nicely, we won't harm a hair of his head. If not, we have ways of making him. Momo's lips were blue with cold. Making him do what? She asked. The voice sounded suddenly shrill and strained. We're tired of collecting people's time by the hour, minute, and second. We want all of it right away, and Aura's got to hand it over. Horrified, Momo stared into the darkness beyond the ring of headlights. What about the people it belongs to? She asked. What will happen to them? People! The voice rose to a scream and broke. People have been obsolete for years. They've made the world a place where there's no room left for their own kind. We shall rule the world. By now the cold was so intense that Momo could barely move her lips, let alone speak. Never fear, though, little Momo, the voice went on, abruptly becoming gentle and almost coaxing. That naturally won't apply to you and your friends. You'll be the last and only people on Earth to play games and tell stories. As long as you stop meddling in our business, we'll leave you in peace. Is it a deal? The voice fell silent. A moment later, it took up the thread from a different quarter. You know we've told you the truth. We'll keep our promise, you can rely on that. And now, take us to Professor Aura. Momo tried to speak, almost fainting with cold. Finally, after several attempts, she said, Even if I could, I wouldn't. What do you mean, if you could? The voice said menacingly. Of course you can. You paid him a visit, so you must know the way. I'd never find it again, Momo whispered. I've tried. Only Cassiopeia knows it. Who's Cassiopeia? The professor's tortoise. Where is it now? Momo, barely conscious, murmured, She came back with me, but I lost her. As if from a long way off, a chorus of agitated voices came to her ears. Issue a general alert, she heard. We've got to find that tortoise. Check every tortoise you come across. The animal's got to be found at all costs. The voices died away. Silence fell. Momo slowly regained her senses. She was standing by herself in the middle of the square. Nothing was stirring but a chill gust of wind that seemed to issue from some great empty void. A wind as gray as ashes. All right, that's the end of chapter 17. Thank you.